Dios nos ha dado promesa, lluvias de gracia enviaré, dones que os den fortaleza, gran bendición os daré. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor, mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Cristo nos dio la promesa del Santo Consolador, dándonos paz y pureza para su gloria y honor. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor, mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Nuestra Señora creyente, todo tu amor y poder, tú eres de gracia la fuente, llena de paz nuestro ser. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor, mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Obra tus siervos piadosos, cedo ver tu mi valor, dándonos dones preciosos, dones del Consolador. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor, mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. We're going to go through our memory verse, our vocabulary. So let's read our verse together this week. Romans 6:23, Romanos 6:23. Porque la paga del pecado es muerte, mas la dádiva de Dios es vida eterna en Cristo Jesús, Señor nuestro. Let's read it together as a class. Romanos 6:23. Porque la paga del pecado es muerte, mas la dádiva de Dios es vida eterna in Cristo Jesús, Señor nuestro. Okay? And so let's go through it word by word. The first word, porque. Now look down at your vocabulary list, the first two words. Porque, that's two separate words, is the question, why? You'd ask someone, porque. But if it's one word spelled out there, porque, that's because. Alright? So for or because is porque. So it's porque la paga, because the payment, the wages, for the wages. Porque la paga del pecado, of sin, es muerte, is death. So for the wages of sin is death. Porque la paga del pecado es muerte. Mas, now this word is tricky too. Look down at your list. About 2/3 of the way down the list. Mas with an accent mark over it means more. And Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong on anything, since you're our native speaker expert this morning. So mas with an accent on it is the word more. Without an accent, it means but. Okay? So it's mas la dádiva de Dios es vida eterna. But the gift of God, mas la dádiva de Dios, of God, es vida eterna, is life eternal, is eternal life, en Cristo Jesús, Señor nuestro. They say, Señor. Señor, not only does that mean sir, but it also means Lord. And so those are the same word. So, en Cristo Jesús, Señor nuestro. So let's go down our vocabularies. We already talked about the difference between porque and porque. And then we talked about la paga is the payment or the wages that you earn. Dios is God. Alguna, alguno. Those words are the word for some, and depending on whether it's masculine or feminine. Remember last week we talked about words that are masculine have these adjectives that end in no, alguno, alguna if the word is feminine. And then católico means Catholic. Mas and mas we talked about. And then nuestro means our. And amigo means friend. So those are the 10 words that you need to memorize this week for the lesson. And then we're going to talk today about conjugating verbs. Now, some of you may or may not know what it means to conjugate a verb, but it's really just, it's something that we do in English, and I'm going to first show you on the board how we do it in English, and then I'm going to show you how to do it in Spanish. we're going to draw this kind of a chart right here, okay? And in order to explain how to conjugate verbs. Now, when we're conjugating verbs, you notice that this chart has how many squares in it? 6, okay? That's because if you look down at your handout at the end there, it says we have, first, second, and third person, and then we have singular and plural. Now, right above here, okay, we're going to call this the singular side right here, okay? Singular, oh, that works better. And then on this right side, we're going to call this plural. Okay? Then we're going to put right here, this is going to be first person, this is going to be second person, and this is going to be third person. Okay? So you can understand where we derive our 6 squares there. Now, on the first person is when I'm talking about myself. Right? First and foremost, I'm talking about myself. Second person is when I'm talking to you. Third person is when I'm talking about someone else. Does everybody understand that? So first person is what? Talking about myself. Second person is talking to you. Third person is talking about someone else. And then of course we know what singular means one. Plural means anything more than one, right? So the person here is going to be I. First person singular, I. Second person singular is going to be you. Third person singular is going to be he or she or it, right? Okay? Then plural is going to be what? We. First person, but more than one of us, we. This is going to be y'all, right? No, I'm just kidding. No, we don't come from the Confederate States of America, so. And then third person is going to be what? They. All right? So that's pronouns, though. He, she, it, you, I, we. These are all pronouns. Now let's say we were to conjugate a verb. Conjugating a verb is basically making the verb match these 6 different scenarios here. Okay? So let's say we want to take a very simple verb, make. Right? So we're talking about make. In fact, actually, you know what? Since we're learning the verb to go in Spanish, let's just use the verb to go in English. So it's going to be what? I go. You go. He goes. Okay, so see how the conjugation is different here? He goes, we go, you go, they go. And you can see, conjugating verbs in English is pretty easy, right? So there's really, most of the time, you just add an S in the third person singular. But other than that, it's pretty easy. So, let's go to Spanish. The first verb we're going to talk about is the verb to go. Okay? So, the first person singular is going to be I go. In order to say that in Spanish, it's going to be this word right here. Voy. Right? V-O-Y. Voy. And then the second person singular is going to be vas. Third person, va. First person plural is going to be vamos. And then we're not going to learn this one, and I'll explain to you why in a moment. And then the third person plural is going to be van. Okay, you got that? Now, these ones are working good? That one. Oh, this one. Okay. So, you say, well, wait a minute. Up here you wrote I go, you go, he goes. Well, in Spanish, usually you leave off the pronoun. You don't usually end up using the pronoun. So it's enough to just say voy. Because they already know that you're saying I go because of the way it's conjugated. So it's a little bit redundant to say yo boy. It's redundant. You don't really have to say it. Now sometimes you may want to say it if you want to just emphasize the fact that you're talking about yourself. But in reality, most of the time you would just use this word right here, just the conjugated verb of I go. And that'll be enough to express what you're trying to say. Does everybody understand that? Now, let's talk about these in Spanish, though, because it's a little bit different than in English. Remember how we learned about how there's formal and informal? And so far, we've been learning everything in the formal. We've been saying, usted, como está usted, right? And we've been using that, which is the usted form falls under this third person category. Okay? When you're talking to people in a formal setting, and you use the word usted, it's like you're talking to them in the third person verb instead of the second person verb. So the second person is going to be the familiar. This is for speaking to a child, speaking to a friend or a family member.
Whereas when you're talking to strangers, if you're out soul winning and you knock on the door and a complete stranger comes to the door, you're going to use the third person, the usted form. Okay? So, if we were to say, I go, let's say we want to say, I go to church, right? And we learned that the first person singular is what? Boy. You're going to say this. Yo, boy, if we were to say the yo, but we can leave this out, so we're going to put that in parentheses because it's not necessary. Voy a la iglesia, right? Now let's say I want to say, you are going to church, but I want to use the formal form. I'm going to say, usted va. Okay, see how we're using the third person singular? Usted va a la iglesia. Okay, now if I were speaking in the familiar form, then I would use the second person singular, which would be vas a la iglesia. This would be to a close friend, a family member, or when speaking to a child. So, voy a la iglesia is first person singular. Usted va a la iglesia, that's what? Formal, so we're using the third person singular. And then vas a la iglesia is the familiar second person singular, which is this word right here. Okay, everybody got that? So, let's say we wanted to say the pastor is going to church. Okay, then we're going to say el pastor, and then what's the verb going to be? Which one are we using? Va a la iglesia. Okay? Got that? So, now let's get into the plural forms. Vamos. If we were to say vamos a la iglesia, what does that mean? We are going to church, right? We go to church. Now, you say, well, why did you leave this one out? Because this form right here, the second person plural, is not used in this part of the world. Now, this is something that's used in some parts of the world, in northern Spain, for example, but in most parts of the world, in California, in Arizona, in Mexico, the parts that we're dealing with, and again, we can't teach you every dialect of Spanish in the world, so we're teaching you what we're dealing with. This is not a form that's used. This is something that has kind of fallen out of the language. This version is omitted right here. So whenever you're speaking to people in the plural form, you're going to use this right here. You're going to say, ustedes van a la iglesia. You all, y'all or you plural are going to church. Ustedes van a la iglesia. Or if we were to say they, let's say, for example, we were going to say David E. Leslie, okay, van a la iglesia, right? Because we're talking about a plural form here, and it's third person. I'm not speaking directly to them, I'm speaking about them. So I'm saying David E. Leslie van. We've got boy, vas, va, vamos, van. And we can leave off the pronouns, that's all we need to say. So, let's say I want to ask a question in Spanish. Now, in Spanish, in order to form a question, you basically just change the order of the verb and the noun. Okay? So, for example, all-purpose cleaner. I don't know if this is going to work.
We're out of Windex.
We're out of Windex? Alright, well, this does the job. So, let's say I wanted to ask a question. And if I wanted to say, you are going to church, I'd say what? I'd say, usted va a la iglesia. Or tú vas a la iglesia. But let's say I want to turn that into a question in Spanish. All I'm going to do is just reverse the order of the noun and the verb. You got that? So, let me finish doing this. And by the way, in Spanish, there's only one present tense that's commonly used. Now in English, we say, I go, or I do go, or I am going, right? All to express the present tense. I do go, I'm going. But in Spanish, that's all expressed by the word boy. So there is no difference between those different things. So, let's say I wanted to ask a question. Are you going to church? And I would do it like this. I would say, ¿Va usted a la iglesia? I can't spell. And then I'd put a question mark at the end. And then, of course, in Spanish, you also put an upside down question mark at the beginning. So that's a question, right? ¿Va usted a la iglesia? ¿Voy yo a la iglesia? Am I going to church? But since we said what? That often we leave this out anyway, you know? We could just go ahead and say, ¿Va a la iglesia? We could just ask that as a question. Or I could say, ¿Vas a la iglesia? ¿Vamos a la iglesia? Are we going to church? Does everybody understand that? So really, this word vamos, or val, or van, or voy, can express a lot more different things than it can in English. Because in English, we say it so many different ways. I do go to church. Yes, I do go to church. Or I am going to church. Or I go to church. Or am I going to church? And we say it all different ways. But in Spanish, it's all just expressed with this one word. Voy a la iglesia. I'm going to church. Voy a la iglesia. I go to church. Voy a la iglesia? Am I going to church? Really? Okay, so do you understand that? So you can, just from learning those 6 words that I just showed you, or really only 5 because we cut out the second person plural, you can really express a lot of different ideas with this. You can ask someone if they're going to church. ¿Va a la iglesia? ¿Va usted a la iglesia? Or you can ask someone personally, ¿Vas a la iglesia? And so that's how you ask questions in Spanish. Now, let's say we wanted to express this idea. The word for today is hoy. Okay? So how would I say, Matthew is going to church today? How am I going to say that in Spanish? Who wants to try it? Lift up your hand if you want to try it. Brother Dave?
Mateo va a la iglesia hoy.
Yep. Mateo va a la iglesia hoy. He is going to church today. Okay. Now, let's say I want to just express that someone goes to church in general. You know, there are some people who go to church and some people who don't, right? So if I want to just say, Mateo va a la iglesia, that could either mean he's going to church right now, or it just means, hey, he goes to church. He's a guy who goes to church. Does everybody understand that? So there's only one first person form here that expresses the idea of continually doing something once. It's just all expressed in this conjugation, okay? Now, what I want you to notice about this verb that we just went through, and this is a slightly irregular verb because the verb is written out like this, ir. Ir means to go, okay? Now this is what's called an infinitive. An infinitive is a verb with the word to in front of it. So if I said to go, to swim, to ride, to ask, to like, those are all infinitive verbs, okay? They're not conjugated. This is the unconjugated form. When we conjugate the verb ir, we come out with this. Voy, vas, va, vamos, and van, right? Everybody got that? Now, notice these endings right here. Amos, you see that? Vas, ba, ban. We see the as, the a, the an, the amos, and then this one is irregular. But there's a classification of verbs, and we're going to learn about this next week, but I want to just get you thinking about it right now, called the AR verbs. Okay? Now this is an exception right here, the first one that we're learning. But the reason that we're learning it is because it's such an important word, to go. Voy a la iglesia. ¿Va usted a alguna iglesia? Do you go to some church anywhere around here? So, AR verbs are verbs that in their infinitive form end in AR. Like for example, one that everybody knows probably, hablar, to speak, right? You've heard it said, say habla español. You'll see that on signs everywhere. The verb hablar is going to conjugate in much the same way as the verb to go. We're going to cut off the AR right there, okay? And we're going to say, hablo, I speak, okay? Hablas, you speak, in the familiar. Habla is going to be he, she, or it speaks. Also, it could be the formal, usted habla. And then in the first person plural, we have hablamos. And then the third person plural, we have hablan. Now notice the similarity between this verb that we just learned, to go, and these right here. Look at these letters are the same. The O, the AS, the A, the amos, and the an. Do you see that? So instead of voy, vas, va, vamos, van, to speak is hablo, hablas, habla, hablamos, and hablan. Does everybody see that similarity here? So really these endings, whenever you see this amos at the end of a present tense verb, you know it's we that are talking. You know it's going to be first person plural. Whenever you see this o at the end, if it's a first person, if it's a present tense verb, we're talking about I speak. Hablas, you speak. Habla, he speaks. Hablamos, we speak. Hablan, they speak. So this is basically conjugating verbs in a nutshell. You're basically taking an infinitive verb to speak, hablar, and you're bringing it into these 6 categories. You're bringing it into an agreement with the pronoun or the noun that you're talking about. There must be an agreement. Let's say I said this. Usted hablamos. Okay. Does that make any sense right there? See, there's a lack of agreement here. This is third person singular word. And you've put this first person plural verb. So this does not compute here. Does everybody understand that? It's usted what? What should I change it to make it make sense? Usted habla. Okay, right? Let's say I said this, and we learned this word a few weeks ago. Nosotros. What does that word mean? We. Okay? Let's say I want to say we go. How am I going to express that? Nosotros vamos. Okay? So there has to be an agreement here between, this is called what? Subject verb agreement. They must agree. They must be in the same part of the chart here. Okay? This is where nosotros factors in this part of the chart. Whoops. Nosotros. Okay? This is where usted factors in, right here. Third person singular. This is where ustedes factors in. This is where yo factors in. This is where tú factors in, right? Now, the only thing tricky about what we learned today, what we learned is pretty easy, right? Pretty simple. But the tricky thing is this usted form. Talking to people in the third person as a way of formality. That's something that we don't have in English. It was around in 1611, as I demonstrated for you in the King James Bible. But today we don't have this. And so this is what you're really going to have to concentrate on, not to accidentally fall into using this ending right here, the AS, when you're talking to people in a formal way. You're going to have to really focus on using the usted and these verbs all the time, right? Now next week we're going to really go over the AR verbs, and we're going to spend the whole time conjugating AR verbs. And we're going to go through a list of 10 different AR verbs, and we're going to conjugate them, we're going to practice and get used to using them. But today I want you to memorize, because you got the handout here, okay? I want you to memorize the verb to go, right? You're going to memorize voy, vas, va, vamos, and van. You're going to memorize those words, and then you're just going to understand the concept here of the root and the endings, of, crossing out the AR, and then throwing these endings on, which are pretty much the same type of endings you find on the verb to go. And so the as, the the amos, the an are all the same. So I want you to think about that this week, because I want you to come to the class next week ready to practice the AR verbs, and ready to put this into practice and take a whole list of verbs and just to be able to just have it right there at your fingertips if we're talking about we, you, they, I, etc. Alright? So let's go ahead and sing our song before we go. Let's go ahead and sing Lluvias de Gracia again. Dios nos ha dado promesa, lluvias de gracia enviaré, dones que os den fortaleza, gran bendición os daré. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor, mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Cristo nos dio la promesa de
Santo Consolador, dándonos paz y pureza para su gloria y honor. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor. Mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Nuestra Señora creyente, todo tu amor y poder. Tú eres de gracia la fuente, llena de paz nuestro ser. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor. Mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador. Obran tus siervos piadosos, cedo ver tu valor, dándonos dones preciosos, dones del Consolador. Lluvias de gracia, lluvias pedimos, Señor. Mándanos lluvias copiosas, lluvias del Consolador.